Yo, what's going on, gamers, coders, speedrunners, and all-around game enthusiasts? This is Joystick Justin here, and welcome to another Java Quick tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about threads. So, first question you might ask is, what is a thread? Well, a thread is kind of like a separate running set of running code in Java. So, if you have two threads, then you can have two completely different sets of code, both running at the same exact time. And that is very useful for certain kinds of code. Say you have a code that it's asking maybe the operating system to give it some information from a text file. Well, then the code's just whatever thread is running that is just going to stop there and wait until it gets the information. But your processor can still run a little bit of other stuff while that's happening. So if you have another thread, you can have two threads running at the same time, so that one thread stops running and is just waiting for the operating system to get back to it. You have another thread that's still running the code and getting the game to keep on working. So here's what I have so far. So I have my initializing my method. I have my main method. So I'm going to make my public thread. So that's my constructor. And so the thing you want to do is if you want to have a thread, you want to say implements runnable, capital R. And when you say implements runnable, then it's going to ask you to implement this method called the run method. The run method is whatever's in this method is what your thread is going to run every time you go through the program. So I'm going to go, let's just go and make the thread. So technically, whenever you run the program for the first time, Java creates a thread automatically, and that's the thread that runs the public static void main. So that means that whatever gets run inside this method right here, and whatever gets run in this method, which means when you make a new thread, it'll run this method. Whatever gets run there, it gets run in the default thread that Java makes when it first starts the program. This thread is going to be a separate thread. I'm also going to have a public boolean running, and I'm just going to, you don't have to have that for running a thread, but I'm going to use it inside the run method, and I'm just going to be like, while running, you're going to run whatever code's in here. And that way you can turn off the thread just by setting running to equal false. So for now, we're going to go true. Okay, and then in here, we're going to initialize the thread. So thread 1 equals new thread. And so in the, it does give you a small bit of an error here. I guess I spelled thread wrong here. Thread. Change type of thread 1 to thread. Huh. Okay, well, anyway, so I'm just spelling things wrong. Thread. This has to be capital. And then in the brackets here, you're going to want to give it whatever class has the run method that you want it to run. So, for example, here I'm going to just say this, which is this method, this class right here, which means thread 1 will look at this run method whenever I tell it to start. And right here, I'm going to just go thread1.start. It's that simple. You start a new thread. And now right here, right after it runs this line, the main thread is going to die because there's nothing else for it to run. But then thread 1 will go over here and run through this, and it will die once this thread 1, though, it won't die. It'll always be here, but it will stop running once it runs out of things to run in the run program. So every time you run thread1.start, it'll go back here and run this. There's also another thing called thread.run, and it does the exact same thing as thread.start. I honestly, if you figure out a difference, tell me in the comments, but there's no difference from what I see between thread.start and thread.run. Both of them make it run through the run method. Okay, so now I'm going to let's set up this thing. I'm gonna go while. I'm gonna have running in here too. And in both of these, I'm gonna go system.out.println, and this will tell us in the print writer which thread is running. And this is the... There you go. So that should be simple enough. And this, if you look here, yeah, there's blah, blah, blah. You can see the main thread. They're both running at the same time. It doesn't really look that way, but there's really not that much code. So if you have two threads that are both, one of them is running a lot of stuff and the other one's not really running that much stuff, you'll see kind of a difference here. But you can see it's kind of random which one is running and which one isn't. So you can see like there are two things running at the same time. And I'll prove it by going like this. Public int count. I'm going to make a counter. And this counter is going to start by equaling 0. So I'm going to go long current time. And I'm going to just make this run for 5 seconds. So long previous time equals current time. Int time equals 5,000 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds. And then here we're going to go current time milliseconds. And then we're going to go if current time gets larger than previous time plus time, this will stop the program. Okay, so now we've coded it so that it runs for 5 seconds. And there you go, it stopped. So now I'm going to prove to you that there are two threads running. And the way I'm going to do that is system.out.println count. Now if there's just, so here's the one thread. It will count every time it runs. And we're going to get something like 68,000. Now if I go count plus plus over here, that number should approximately double, because there's now this other thread that's also running at the same time. Yeah, as you can see, there's slightly more because it has to go through this if statement, so the other thread has to go through a little bit more stuff, but you can see this number kind of close to doubling. Not exactly, but you can see that that's because there are two threads running at the same time. So that's really all you need to do in order to implement a thread. Now, what if you want to have two different threads that run different programs? Well, I have made a second thread over here, and it's a very, very simple program. It implements runnable, again, so it implements a thread. And I have no constructor here, honestly, but the run method, it has its own running, and the second thread is running. And we have a running here. So basically what I want to do here is I'm going to initialize a second thread class by going private second thread equals second thread. And then we're going to initialize it over here. We're going to go second thread equals new second thread. So now we've initialized the second thread, but we actually don't have any thread that will run the second thread. So right here, as I said before, this, it means that the thread, this class is the one that it looks for the run method in. So what if I want to make another thread? Public thread thread2. Well, then over here, I'm going to go thread2 equals new thread. And instead of saying this, if we did that, it would just run the run method in this class. But if I wanted to make it run the other run method in this class, what I would do is change this to second thread, which is this one. So that means that thread2 looks into this class and looks at this run method. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's how you make a different run method. Run a different thread. So every time you want to have a new run method, you need to make a different class and then implement runnable. And then whatever you put in here, whatever you put in this class's run method, that's whatever will get run for that class. So if I run this, you can see that there are 3 threads, actually. There are 3 threads going on right now. And as you can see, the first 2 threads actually terminated. And the second thread is the only one that's running. And that's because the running for this thread has not been turned off. So if I want to make it turn off, we have to go second thread.running equals false. And now, whenever the time reaches 5 seconds, all 3 threads will stop. As you can see there. Second thread, there's a main thread in there. If I scroll through here, you can see the other thread, the second thread, the main thread. There are 3 threads happening. The second thread really has nothing happening because it's not even counting. So if I wanted to even get a little bit more complicated, I could make this count as well. And then it would keep track of how many times it has run through the second thread as well. So yeah, but that's multi-threading. That's really all you need to know about multi-threading. So if I want another thread, I just go here, new, class, implement runnable, and give it a new run method. So that's how you create a thread. Now, I'm going to also go over here and show you a practical application of multi-threading. So here's a game that I've been coding. And if I go into the main game and the tick thread. So I have 2 threads. I have the main game implementing runnable, and I have the tick thread also implementing runnable. Now you can also tell the thread you can make the thread in the second class. So I have thread 2 here, and it's in this class instead. You don't have to worry about a lot of this code. This is the start method. Whenever I start the program, this start method gets run. So it says running to be true. It starts the first thread, and then tells you that the first thread has started. So if I run this, first thread started, and then there's a second thread that also gets started. So if I go in the tick thread, and its start method also says second thread started. And that's what this is. Tick thread.start, that goes into here and tells it to start, which starts the second method. And so basically what I have happening here is it basically sets the running to true, and then it has all this math that happens here, setting the target FPS. And this FPS, I meant for it to be 30, but you can have the FPS be at whatever you want it to be. I have 30 frames per second. And so there are 2 methods simply because before I had a second thread implemented, I had tick and render happening at the same time. So tick would be basically updating the character's position, updating where your mouse is on the screen, all that kind of stuff would happen through tick. Render would then put everything to the screen. But with tick thread, I have game.tick here and there's no render here, so the game is getting ticked and rendered at the same time, which actually increases the frames per second, I've noticed. Because, like I said before, if the game is trying to print something to a file, it'll sit there and wait for that to happen before it keeps going. The thread will get used up to do that. So you can have the tick printing something to a file, but the game will still get rendered. So yeah, and that's how this game works. It runs off of 2 threads. One for rendering, and one for updating his position, opening the inventory, finding out if I've clicked a certain place, and all that kind of stuff. It all gets rendered and ticked in 2 separate threads. So that's one practical use of multi-threading. There's many, many uses of multi-threading, but that's one way you can use multi-threading. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've learned a little bit. And as always, don't forget to keep on gaming.